I never imagined that I would one day find myself standing against an entire real estate developer. It certainly was not over something hidden beneath the ground, something I did not even notice at first. Looking back now, though, I realized the trouble started the very day I signed the papers for that property. I had unknowingly stepped into a situation that had been unraveling long before I arrived. My name is Evan Carter, and I settled in Willow Creek Valley. At least, I used to call it living. It was more like a peaceful existence on 15 quiet acres filled with towering trees and open meadows. A modest cabin sat beside a slow-moving creek, nothing luxurious, just a simple place where the sound of the wind was louder than the voices of people. For years, that peaceful routine was everything I needed. Then Cedar Ridge Estates appeared beyond the tree line, and everything slowly began to change. At first, the new development seemed harmless, maybe even impressive from a distance. Massive entrance signs rose beside the highway, polished brochures promised elegant homes, and advertisements showcased an artificial lake surrounded by a clubhouse, tennis courts, and a resort-style swimming pool. They marketed the community as though it were an exclusive vacation destination where residents could enjoy luxury every day of the year. Their favorite slogan was always the same: untouched wilderness views, as if they were selling nature itself while carefully controlling every inch of it. I remember thinking the whole concept felt a little strange, but it was none of my concern because my property belonged to me, or at least that was what I believed. The creek flowing across my land had carved its path long before any developer ever arrived, carrying crystal-clear water over stone and earth as though it held generations of memories within its current. During the first year after construction started, nothing seemed especially unusual. There were more dump trucks rumbling along the county road, the distant hum of heavy machinery, and the occasional echo of equipment working across the valley. None of it reached my cabin in any meaningful way. Then, sometime during the second year, things began changing so gradually that I almost overlooked them. It started with an odd smell drifting through the woods during hot afternoons. It carried the scent of something organic, yet deeply unpleasant. I convinced myself it was probably a dead deer somewhere upstream or perhaps algae growing in the summer heat. Living in the countryside teaches you that strange things happen, and worrying about every one of them only steals your peace. Still, the odor refused to disappear. It lingered longer every week, and before long I noticed the creek itself no longer looked the way it always had. At first, there was only a faint discoloration, but eventually the water developed a muddy brown tint that stopped me in my tracks one morning. I had never seen that creek look anything like it before. For several minutes, I simply stood there staring into the water, wondering if I was imagining the change. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I had become overly observant. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became that something was entering the creek from somewhere upstream. It was not natural, and whatever it was, it flowed continuously. That afternoon, I followed the water through thick brush, hiking much farther than I usually did. I kept telling myself I would eventually find nothing and turn back feeling foolish. Instead, I found signs that someone had disturbed the ground. At first, the evidence was subtle, but as I continued walking, it became impossible to ignore. The soil had been compacted where no vehicle should ever have traveled. Then I finally spotted it. A section of pipe partially buried beneath roots and dirt, hidden so carefully it almost disappeared into the forest floor. I stood there for a long time trying to understand what I was seeing because it clearly was not an irrigation line or ordinary drainage. It looked industrial, intentionally concealed. As I mentally traced the direction it traveled, I realized it did not lead toward farmland or deeper into the valley. It ran directly toward Cedar Ridge Estates. I desperately wanted another explanation because accepting the truth meant acknowledging that someone had been using my property without my knowledge or permission. The more closely I investigated, however, the more obvious the reality became. The pipe belonged to a much larger system, and it was transporting waste. Not stormwater, not runoff, raw sewage. I returned to my cabin that evening with mud covering my boots and a knot in my stomach unlike anything I had ever felt. It was a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and anger that had only begun to surface. I immediately called the property management office for Cedar Ridge Estates. A man named Mark Delaney answered in a calm, almost uninterested voice, sounding as though every complaint bored him before it was even spoken. I carefully explained what I had discovered, trying to remain polite. The moment I mentioned the hidden pipe, he interrupted me. According to him, it was probably an old utility line that had existed for years and was nothing to worry about. I actually laughed because the excuse sounded completely rehearsed. Their luxury development had existed for barely 2 years. There was absolutely nothing old or grandfathered about a brand new sewage system crossing private property. That was the moment his attitude subtly changed. He did not sound frightened. Instead, he sounded calculating, almost as if he were deciding exactly how much information he should reveal. He suggested there may have been some misunderstanding and casually mentioned that they could discuss financial compensation for the inconvenience. That single word echoed in my mind, inconvenience, as though we were talking about a misplaced fence or an easement dispute instead of what appeared to be a hidden sewage pipeline contaminating my creek. I told him I had no interest in taking money. I wanted the line removed completely and rerouted through the proper legal channels. I gave the company 30 days to fix the problem before I involved every authority I could think of. The line stayed silent for a brief moment before Mark let out a quiet chuckle. Then he warned me that I should think very carefully before starting a battle I had no chance of winning. Without another word, he ended the call, leaving me alone in the silence of that long, uneasy night. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the murky creek, the strange odor drifting through the trees, and that hidden pipe buried beneath my land like a concealed vein carrying something I had never been meant to discover. By sunrise, my decision had already been made. I was done pretending the problem might solve itself. I spent the morning digging through public records, county databases, permit applications, and property filings, searching for anything connected to Cedar Ridge Estates. What I uncovered did far more than confirm my fears. It made everything worse. Buried in the paperwork was an easement agreement supposedly granting permission for the utility line to cross my property. The problem was that the document had been filed after construction was already underway, and the signature printed across the bottom was allegedly mine. I had never seen that paper before in my life. I sat there staring at the screen, unable to believe how casually something so important could be fabricated. It was unsettling to realize that one forged signature could transform private property into someone else's disposal route. That was the exact moment I stopped believing this had been an oversight. It was a carefully built system, and I had unknowingly become trapped inside it. Whether I accepted it or not no longer mattered. From that point forward, everything changed because the instant I understood what they had done, I stopped being nothing more than a quiet landowner. I became a problem they could no longer afford to ignore. If you had asked me before all of this happened, I probably would have believed a simple conversation or a strongly worded letter could settle almost any dispute. That illusion disappeared sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning while I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the forged easement document glowing on my laptop screen. I kept reading every line, hoping that if I looked at it long enough, some explanation would suddenly appear that made the whole thing reasonable. It never happened. The document remained exactly what it was, evidence that someone had decided my property rights were optional. Oddly enough, I was no longer shaking with anger or disbelief. I had already moved beyond that stage. What settled over me instead was a cold, focused clarity. It was the kind of realization nobody wants, the understanding that nobody else was going to step in and fix this on my behalf. If anything was going to change, I would have to force it myself. The following morning, I drove straight to the county offices. I was not yelling or making demands. I was simply determined to gather every piece of information available. I requested every permit, environmental report, infrastructure map, utility plan, and filing connected to Cedar Ridge Estates. The clerk behind the counter hesitated ever so slightly when I mentioned the development's name, and that tiny pause told me far more than any words could have. I spent hours waiting under harsh fluorescent lights, filling out request forms, sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs, and watching the clock crawl by. Eventually, enough records were released for me to piece together the bigger picture. The developers had submitted an easement application after construction had already begun, claiming the utility route was essential infrastructure. Attached to that application was a scanned signature that supposedly belonged to me. Anyone who had ever seen me sign a document would have known immediately that it was fake. When I pointed that out to one of the county supervisors, her expression changed instantly. She grew unusually quiet, as though she had suddenly realized the situation had crossed into territory that could not simply be brushed aside. She explained that the easement request had actually been rejected once before, yet the system continued listing the utility route as unresolved enforcement. That was the first time I heard the official phrase, unauthorized utility passage, which sounded far more polite than the reality. In plain language, it meant someone had illegally routed sewage through my property and hoped I would never discover it. I walked out of the county building carrying a thick stack of copied documents and a growing pressure behind my eyes. It was not quite rage yet, but I could feel it building with every passing hour. This time, when I contacted Cedar Ridge Estates, I refused to speak with the property manager. I requested their director instead and was eventually transferred to a man named Richard Holston. He spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years convincing people to accept bad situations without actually fixing them. I explained everything I had uncovered: the hidden pipe, the contaminated creek, the forged easement, and the county's rejected application. When I finished, there was a long silence on his end of the call. I could hear him breathing before he finally spoke. His first words were something I have never forgotten. He calmly said, "Evan, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." I almost laughed because the statement revealed exactly what I needed to know. They already understood how serious the situation was. They were simply hoping I did not. I told him there was no version of reality where this remained a small issue. They had 30 days to remove the line and reroute it legally, or I would involve environmental enforcement agencies and pursue fraud charges over the forged paperwork. The conversation changed instantly after that. His relaxed tone disappeared and was replaced with something much sharper and noticeably irritated, as though I had stepped outside the role they expected me to play. Off the record, he suggested I should think about accepting a settlement that would allow the issue to disappear quietly. He reminded me that legal battles were expensive, time-consuming, and exhausting. Then he repeated that same ridiculous word again: inconvenience. Hearing him describe an illegal sewage pipeline beneath my property as an inconvenience made my decision easier than ever. I told him once again that I had no interest in money. I wanted the damage corrected. He answered with the familiar corporate promise, "We'll see what we can do," which sounded exactly like a commitment to do absolutely nothing unless someone forced action. That evening, I kept thinking about how long the contamination had already been flowing unnoticed. For nearly 2 years, waste had been traveling beneath my soil, through the creek I depended on, and across the land I believed I knew so well. I stopped waiting for someone else to act. I contacted the County Environmental Health Department, the State Environmental Protection Office, and a nonprofit legal organization that specialized in rural contamination cases. I handed over everything I had gathered: documents, photographs, the precise location of the pipeline, and the water quality records I had already begun collecting myself. At first, I assumed it would take weeks before anyone even responded. At first, I assumed nothing would happen for weeks. Government investigations are rarely known for moving quickly, and I expected endless delays before anyone even looked at my complaint. I was completely wrong. The moment I used phrases like contamination pathway and unauthorized discharge into a natural water system, everything changed. Those words carried weight, and within just 7 days inspectors arrived on site. I remember standing at a distance early one morning, watching their trucks line up near the edge of Cedar Ridge Estates. Men and women in reflective safety vests stepped out carrying clipboards, testing equipment, and water sampling kits. For the first time since the development had appeared across the valley, I saw something inside those polished gates that wasn't carefully managed for appearances. There were no smiling sales representatives or glossy advertisements anymore. Instead, there were investigators asking questions, collecting evidence, and walking the land with serious expressions. It was the first crack in the carefully maintained image Cedar Ridge had spent years building. While the inspection was underway, I started considering my own legal options much more carefully. By then I knew exactly where the unauthorized pipeline crossed my property, and I had already learned something most landowners never realize until they are forced into a similar situation. When someone installs an illegal utility line across private land without permission, the property owner has legal rights that extend far beyond simply filing complaints. I wasn't interested in creating some dramatic act of revenge or making headlines. I hired a licensed excavation company with a solid reputation and gave them one simple instruction. I wanted the section of pipeline crossing my creek boundary uncovered so it could be properly documented. Nothing more. When the excavation began, it didn't feel exciting or cinematic. It felt heavy with reality. Buckets of dirt rolled away as roots snapped beneath the machinery, slowly revealing something that had spent years hidden beneath the surface. Eventually the pipe emerged once again, much larger than I had expected. It was wrapped in aging insulation and buried deep enough that no reasonable person could believe it had been placed there by accident. The excavation foreman looked over at me and quietly asked if I was certain I wanted to continue. I looked back at him and answered without hesitation. I wasn't destroying anyone else's property. I was exposing infrastructure that had never been legally allowed to exist on mine. Once the pipeline was fully exposed, I made the decision that ultimately changed everything. I instructed the crew to construct a temporary containment barrier at the exact point where the line crossed my property. The barrier remained entirely inside my property boundaries and complied with emergency environmental protection guidelines because there was reasonable suspicion of contamination entering a natural waterway. As the workers finished shaping the earth, I stood nearby watching the creek slow slightly before redirecting around the newly built barrier. For a strange moment, it almost felt as though the land itself had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. I honestly couldn't predict every consequence that would follow, but one thing had become absolutely certain in my mind. Whatever had been quietly flowing through that illegal pipeline for the last 2 years would no longer pass unnoticed beneath my property. If the waste couldn't continue through my land, it would eventually be. I wasn't actually there when the first overflow occurred. Ironically, I only heard it, and somehow that made the entire experience even more unsettling. Sound travels differently across an open valley. It echoes through forests and fields with surprising clarity. That morning I was standing outside my cabin, holding a cup of coffee, when distant shouting drifted across the landscape. At first I couldn't make out any words, only sharp bursts of panic carried on the wind. It was the unmistakable sound people make when something they completely trusted suddenly fails in spectacular fashion. Before I even had time to process what I was hearing, my phone began ringing over and over again. The screen filled with unfamiliar numbers that I ignored until the county inspector I had met during the investigation finally called. His voice was serious and direct. He simply told me to stay away from the creek because they were dealing with a major containment issue. He didn't need to explain any further. I already understood exactly what he meant. What surprised me wasn't that the system had failed. It was how quickly everything unraveled once the illegal pipeline stopped functioning the way Cedar Ridge had always expected. The entire sewage network inside the development had clearly been designed around one dangerous assumption: that the hidden line beneath my property would quietly carry waste away forever without attracting attention. Once that route encountered real resistance, the system had nowhere left to send its flow. Infrastructure like that doesn't simply shut down when blocked. Pressure builds until it forces its way somewhere else. By the middle of the morning, I could see unusual activity from the ridge overlooking the development. Maintenance trucks raced through the gated streets, while work crews hurried between different sections of the property. Soon afterward, the familiar smell reached my cabin again, except this time it was far stronger than anything I had experienced before. It no longer lingered faintly in the background. It overwhelmed the entire valley. I stayed where I belonged, inside my own property lines, interfering with nothing. There was no reason to get involved because every process I had started was already unfolding exactly as the law intended. Later that afternoon, my phone rang once more. This time it was Richard Holston. The difference in his voice was impossible to miss. Gone was the calm confidence he had displayed during our earlier conversations. Now he sounded tense, frustrated, and barely able to hide his desperation. He opened the call by saying, "Evan, "We have a situation." I remember thinking how strangely polite that description sounded considering what I already suspected was happening. I calmly replied that I assumed the real situation was the illegal sewage pipeline crossing my property. After a long silence, he finally admitted they were experiencing severe backflow throughout multiple sections of the community's infrastructure, including storm drainage systems and several low-lying areas surrounding their recreational facilities. I didn't answer immediately. I simply let the silence linger because, for the first time, the consequences of their decisions were becoming impossible for them to ignore. Part 4. The moment that everyone still talks about arrived during Cedar Ridge's annual summer celebration. Anyone who witnessed it firsthand, or even heard about it afterward, never forgot it. The development had spent weeks promoting a grand community gala around their resort-style swimming pool. Elegant white tents had been set up across the grounds. Live musicians entertained the crowd. Catered meals were arranged under decorative lights, and families wandered through the event dressed as though they had stepped out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. For the first part of the evening, everything probably looked exactly the way the developers had imagined. Then, without warning, that picture-perfect atmosphere began to unravel. I wasn't inside the community when it happened. I was nearly a quarter-mile away on my own property. Even from that distance, though, I could tell something had gone terribly wrong. I saw groups of people suddenly changing direction, gathering together in confusion, then freezing in place as if the entire rhythm of the event had been interrupted by something nobody understood. Later, one of the county officials who had been present told me exactly how the situation unfolded. According to him, the earliest warning sign was an unusual discoloration spreading through the pool water. Shortly afterward, maintenance crews noticed pressure problems developing within the lower drainage network. Before anyone had time to fully investigate, the entire system failed almost simultaneously. A containment breakdown forced contaminated backflow directly into the pool infrastructure while the event was still in progress. By the time staff realized what was happening, dozens of people were already standing in the water that had served as the centerpiece of the celebration only moments earlier. In an instant, what had been advertised as a luxury community showcase turned into something nobody wanted to describe aloud. The evacuation that followed wasn't dramatic in the way movies portray disasters. It was chaotic because it was real. Parents grabbed frightened children. People slipped while trying to get away. Voices echoed across the property, and employees desperately attempted to shut down equipment that had already been overwhelmed by the failure. Watching events unfold from a distance, I didn't feel any sense of celebration or victory. It wasn't because I sympathized with the developers. It was because, for the first time, I truly understood the enormous scale of what they had been forcing through my property long before I ever discovered the truth. Later that night, Richard Holston called once again. This conversation was completely different from everyone that had come before it. The polished corporate confidence had disappeared entirely. What remained was pure exhaustion. His voice sounded worn down as he admitted they needed to resolve the situation immediately, no matter what it required. I told him the solution had always been straightforward. The illegal sewage system needed to be rerouted through a lawful and properly engineered treatment process. Every contaminated section of my property had to be professionally cleaned and restored. Most importantly, the company needed to acknowledge in writing that they had used my land without authorization. This time there was no argument, no attempt to minimize the damage, and no offers to quietly make the problem disappear. He simply listened because there was nothing left to deny. Reality had finally caught up with every shortcut they had taken. Over the following weeks, state environmental authorities issued substantial fines, mandatory construction orders, and legally enforceable cleanup requirements. Cedar Ridge Estates was forced to install the proper treatment infrastructure they had avoided building from the very beginning simply because it would have cost more money. The irony wasn't lost on me for a single second. They had tried to save a fortune by secretly routing their problem across my property, only to spend far more fixing the consequences once the truth came out. Eventually, their attorneys presented me with a settlement that covered not only every dollar I had invested in the land but significantly more, along with legally binding commitments to restore the creek and repair the environmental damage. I accepted the agreement, but I refused to remove the containment barrier until inspectors confirmed that every section of the illegal pipeline had been disconnected, rerouted through an approved system, and every environmental test showed clean results. Only then did I allow the barrier to come down. Slowly, almost as though it were healing from a long illness, the creek returned to its familiar crystal-clear flow. I remember sitting beside it one quiet evening, listening to the gentle sound of the water and realizing how peaceful silence feels after months of conflict finally come to an end. Cedar Ridge Estates never truly recovered from everything that followed. The financial losses were enormous, public confidence disappeared, and the damage to their reputation lingered long after construction crews had finished their work. I doubt anyone involved in that project ever imagined that one quiet piece of privately owned land would ultimately expose the weakness of their entire operation. Looking back now, I still wonder about what happened. I honestly don't know whether what followed should be called justice or simply the unavoidable consequences of choices catching up with the people who made them. Maybe it was a little of both. Pressure has a way of revealing hidden weaknesses, especially when there is nowhere left for it to escape. Even today, I occasionally find myself thinking about where responsibility truly begins and where it finally ends. I'd like to know what you think. Share your opinion in the comments below, and if you enjoy hearing true-to-life property dispute stories like this one, be sure to subscribe because there are plenty more stories still waiting to be told.